Hello, psychology students. Mr. G here with our second topic from Unit 2, neuroanatomy. So we talked about in our first topic, we actually talked about the biology of the brain and some of the aspects that go along with what different parts of the brain do, what different hemispheres do, and maybe even ways that they've been treated or manipulated or operated on. But now we're going to look at a little bit of the greater part of the whole system of the brain, which would include what we call neuroanatomy. That would be your nervous system and something called neurons, what we call neurocommunication, and a little bit on behavioral genetics as well. So, essentially hooked into our brain. All right, there are essentially two nervous systems. There's the CNS, the central nervous system, which is the brain itself, and the spinal cord, right? So basically, let me go back here. So the brain itself, look how it's hooked up to this very long spinal cord, right? And then you have what you call your peripheral nervous system, which is basically the different nerves that come off the brain and the spinal cord to the rest of your body, or the PNS. So all these different nerves and stuff that are coming off the CNS, which again, that's basically your spinal cord with your brain. This is your CNS, and then all these little nerves that come off of it that communicate to the CNS or central nervous system. This is your PNS, your peripheral nervous system. It's out on the periphery, going all the way to your extremes. Okay. So there is one little trick I wanted to actually throw out there that the body has up its sleeve. There's actually something out there. It's called the reflex arc. It's the processing of info that doesn't pass through the brain first. And basically, it would be like touching a hot surface with your finger. The sensory cells in your skin would actually work faster to send info to the spinal cord. So basically, hey, that's hot, get your hand off, than your brain's decision on how to respond to that sensation instead of, oh, I am putting my finger here. Hot. Oh, now I feel, it's like almost a complete reflex without the brain even processing it first. Something, a little something God built into our systems to in his own intelligence that kind of work in outside almost of the central nervous system and so on. So I thought that was interesting. Here's another view of it. Basically, they call it the pain reflex, right? It's basically the info is actually carried right along to your what you call your skin receptors, right? And from there, it's passed via what we call interneurons to motor neurons, and that'll lead you to pull away your hand. So it almost like bypasses that central nervous system up to your brain, and it just goes straight to the skin almost, right? Skin receptors straight to make the part of your brain, the motor part, pull your finger off. So just a little something I thought God put out there in his intelligence. That's pretty cool. But here's another view of the peripheral versus central nervous systems and what they do. And I'm not going to go into great detail. You would probably do this more in a anatomy course if you're taking Mr. Diaz's class. He'll teach you about something called autonomic versus somatic, controls of the body. He'll probably even talk to you about what we call sympathetic arousing versus parasympathetic. We're going to focus more on the neurons and what they do and how that maybe can affect behavior and even things going on with you psychologically, right? So let's define what a neuron is. So basically, a neuron, you probably may have learned about this in biology class, or some of you might be taking right now a anatomy course or have taken an anatomy course. They're basically all the nerve cells that are connected to the brain. So basic unit of the entire brain and its nervous system is made up of these neurons, right? Or glial cells will actually act like glue to hold all the neurons in the body together to provide nutrition for them, protect them, provide the sodium, the potassium that they need. And this is actually, and again, they're very, very microscopic, but here is like a view of what a motor neuron would look like. And it's pretty cool. We're going to break that down here in a second. So basically, a neuron has three functions: sensory, motor, and interneural. So sensory in that it will help process along the taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight. The motor aspects, it signals from the brain to the muscles and organs to move. And it's also interneural. It relays messages to pass between the neurons, almost like it's electricity. It's pretty cool. So the parts of the neurons. So the soma, so this thing here is their soma, right? Okay. And that's basically the proteins for the neuron being is created right there. God set this whole thing up intelligently, and a lot of it is functioning in a way where a lot of it does its own work. It's pretty cool. And then you have with these things are dendrites. They're like these tree branches, right? These things here. And these dendrites basically receive signals from other neurons or other cells. And it comes into this one here. And then this thing here is your axon, right? And we'll look at that in the next slide. And it's coded to kind of protect almost like the electricity that passes through it with something called myelin coating or a myelin sheath. All right. So basically let's break down the actual axon itself. Okay. So the actual axon itself would be found along it's an outside the brain and spinal column, so throughout the body, right? And connecting into your central nervous system. So, and it's in your peripheral nervous system. So these axons are basically everywhere, from the tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes into your spinal cord through your brain, right? And again, as you can see, they're very tube-like and they're communicating through and to the brain, right? And they're also coated, like I was telling you, with like a sheath that insulates these fibers and increases the speed of their conduction, just like a wire in its sense, right? Here's like a wire here is coated with something to kind of protect the electricity that carries on the charges and also protect you from getting shocked as well. Now, when the myelin sheath, though, degenerates, communication along your central nervous system be disrupted, and you can experience some pretty intense pain. And you would have basically a disorder, what we would call multiple sclerosis or MS. You may have heard of this before. So basically, the myelin coating is eroding in your axon. And when that coating or even parts of it are lost, the axons will no longer effectively send signals to and from the brain throughout the body. And it will affect your behavior. And maybe you would even become almost uncoordinated, or sometimes you would be filled with so much pain. You just like, I can't even move. I just want to just sit still. I'm in such pain. Sometimes extreme heat, extreme cold can even make it worse. Probably one of the most famous people within the last 20 years who have had MS is Montel Williams. He was a famous talk show host in the early 2000s. You'll still see him crop up now. We're going to watch some videos with him with the famous Dr. Oz. Dr. Oz today, I think even at one point ran for Senate up in Pennsylvania, but today he's working in the Trump administration, something related to health, of course. But anyway, so let's talk about what the dendrites did. So we talked about like, here about the axon and what happens if this myelin sheath goes away. But the dendrites stick out from the cell body or the soma, and there are hundreds of thousands of these just for one neuron coming off of a soma. And but basically what they're doing is you're receiving the impulses and messages from connecting to other neuron cells, and then they send them right to that cell body. And then out of the cell body, those messages and neurons basically get sent along that axon. And by the way, the word dendrite is Greek for tree because it looks like branches coming out like that. All right, the characteristics of neurons, you can't completely replace themselves. So any damaged axon fibers in the nerves, they really they can't be regrown. And some, I mean, there is some, yeah, I guess there is some theories and ideas out there that they can be regrown and some movement in the limbs can be regained. So some of the medications and treatments are really trying to work on that. But with MS, damage can be permanent and irreversible. And that's why people can get into such pain and some eventually die from it or they become immobile from it. Again, here's a larger view. And again, you also have the ending part of the axon, which is the terminal branches, which form junctions with other cells, and they basically will send out the messages to the connecting neurons. So the dendrites receive the messages in, and then the terminal branches send out the messages. And you can see it through here again. So dendrites receiving in the messages, and then it gets sent along the axon and then out the axon terminal to the next neuron. And this is connected extremely throughout your body through what we would call almost an electrical impulse, right? Actually, they've done some study on this that the speed of a neuron, it can range from 2 to 180 miles an hour and it's could be almost measured in milliseconds, thousands of a second. It's pretty powerful. We're going to do something in class where you actually get to make a candy neuron. So we'll work on that too to give you kind of like a better view of what a neuron looks like. But let's go a little deeper into how the neurons communicate and they push through these things called neurotransmitters. Okay. So again, dendrites are receiving in communication from other neurons. It's sending through the axon and then out of the axon terminals to the next dendrites. And you can see that right there, right? And what's happening right here in this gap, there's almost like a small gap. And here it is. Here would be an axon terminal, right? And again, axon terminals are these little things with little buttons at the bottom. Coming out of them will be neurotransmitters, okay? And you can see them as depicted here, these little green ball-like things here. And then between that and the dendrite of the next neuron, there's what we call a synaptic gap. And they're on the next neuron or the dendrite of that next neuron, there's what we call receptive sites, okay? And then these little neurotransmitters, and we're going to talk about all the different neurotransmitters, those are actually being passed from one axon or one neuron to the next. And then after a while, you can see here, there's actually the sending neuron normally will reabsorb excess neurotransmitters that don't get used up and be reuptaked back into the axon terminal of the sending one. It's a pretty powerful and complex process that God created, but if everything's working right, it's a great way for the parts of your body that to communicate feelings and different sensations and so on. So, what would be the function of these little green things? Again, these green things are what we call neurotransmitters being passed from one neuron to the other. All right. They can be either excitatory, all right. So basically, they can excite connecting neurons, fire them up, or they can be inhibitory. They would prevent the next neuron from firing. So again, God created essentially two types here. But what they're doing is they're creating balance or what we call homeostasis. I'm sure you learned that term in science within your brain and body. So probably the most important of all your neurotransmitters would be acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, glutamate, and endorphins. Endorphins is really important because that's the one that will relieve pain and stress in your body. And it's released actually by your pituitary gland. It's your brain's natural aspirin. And that would allow you, like when you're exercising, to feel like basically an endorphin rush to kind of power through the pain. There's sometimes the endorphins are not going to be enough. So sometimes we'll have to take aspirin and Tylenol and stuff. But God did give us a natural aspirin as well. So we're going to watch a video on neurotransmitters and how your brain works. But again, here are the main ones that that will be tested on, as you can see it. And you can even see here what their function is, especially if they're more of an excitatory one or inhibitory one. But dopamine is the one that will influence, your movement. And if you don't have enough dopamine, again, that's why people with Parkinson's disease get stiff or they have tremors. They don't have enough of it. But they found people with too much dopamine can actually have schizophrenia. So um, Alzheimer's disease. They found out that if you have Alzheimer's, ACH or acetylcholine, which is enabling muscle action, memory, learning, there's not enough of that. Serotonin is one you've probably heard of, right? Which is affecting mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. Not enough. You're probably struggling with depression. Some antidepressant drugs will try to raise serotonin levels. There's also some supplements that can do that as well. Um, and so on. So we'll look at some of these here too. And I've actually have a silly aid for memorizing what each of the different, neurotransmitters do. No, it's kind of cheesy, but it may actually help you out a little bit. All right. There is hope, though, for people with traumatic brain injury. And again, I mentioned this like in the last unit, but there's a great term, and I love this, how the Lord created our bodies in many ways to even kind of repair themselves, or our brain itself to repair itself, what we would call neuroplasticity. It's the ability of the brain to adapt and change to create new neurons, form new neural communications or pathways, recruit neurons from different parts of the brain to perform functions once performed by damaged neurons. That's an incredibly intelligent design how our brain is. Now, when we're younger, it definitely works stronger, but even when we're older, neuroplasticity can definitely serve its purpose to repair parts of the brain that were damaged. But long-term things like drug use or a severe brain injury can definitely make the neuroplasticity issue may not be as good of strong as a factor in those cases. But getting into actually Parkinson's disease. So again, when there's not enough dopamine in the body, it's a degenerative CNS central nervous system disorder. So basically, it's causing you to lose basically voluntary muscle control. You can't control your movement. You're doing this, or maybe there's some type of jittering that you probably have seen people have this. A lot of times there's rigidity in the walk. Definitely get even some of them lose the ability to walk after a while. Usually 50 or older is the onset, but there are unusual cases, such as in the case of famous actor Michael J. Fox. You may have seen him in the 1980s movie Back to the Future. He actually has Parkinson's disease. It affects both genders. Equally. So, and we'll watch some videos about him and how he's become a spokesman for the disease and how they're trying to find cures. And he spent many hours into this. There's other types of Parkinson's disease aside the one that Michael J. Fox has. There's one called idiopathic Parkinson's disease, which is, and then there's secondary. All right. Idiopathic is the main Parkinson's disease that we know about, but the secondary Parkinson's disease is the one that could be caused by trauma, a tumor, a cerebrovascular incident, something with blood vessels in the brain. It could even be drug induced, or it could be through being hit in the head way too much. And we'll talk about Muhammad Ali here in a second, but there is no cure currently for any of the Parkinson's. There is a drug that was actually used, a treatment, not a cure, but cardadopa or L-dopa, which will help stimulate the creation of dopamine and help with some of the tremors. Again, though, Parkinson's is a progressive disease, so it does get worse over time. So you would have to increase the intake of L-dopa after a while. And there is a side effect also of carbidopa or L-dopa. It can, lead to too much dopamine in your system. So, which again can lead to schizophrenia. So, We also believe Adolf Hitler had Parkinson's. We're going to be watching some videos about that. He did try to hide that. And of course, it's kind of interesting because those are the type of people that had Parkinson's that were sent away to camps and euthanized. But Hitler himself, I'm not going to, we're not going to put me myself in the camp. So very interesting. It seems like things that maybe Hitler felt bad or hated in his own self it's like he projected that on others and wanted them killed. So, all right, let's look at some of the brain injuries that can happen, all related to neurons. Basically, brain trauma is a physical accident where the head receives a severe blow, and it will cause what we call a neural metabolic crisis, where neurons become depolarized. There's altered blood flow. There's calcium ions being released and entered into neurons, which are not supposed to be there, calcium ions, and that will cause dizziness, confusion, headaches, cause you to get knocked out, what we call loss of consciousness. It could even cause you to have either temporary memory issues, vision issues. This could be caused by auto accidents, sports injuries, sudden blows to the head, which happen a lot in boxing, a lot of concussions or what we call knockouts. But some of the people have been knocked out in other sports, soccer, from being kicked in the head or a ball hitting their head really hard. Hockey players have been knocked out by pucks hitting them pretty hard. Baseball players, football players from being tackled pretty hard. In most cases, a general concussion will cause no permanent damage to your skull or brain. It just shakes you up violently and knocks you out. But receiving several concussions over the course of your life, that can lead to deterioration of brain function, cause problems with equilibrium and balance, several severe headaches, and other maladies. Usually, what happens when someone gets an initial concussion, they experience what we call flaccid paralysis, basically get knocked out and you're almost like, special note though, head punches sustained in boxing match cause the brain to actually collide with the skull. That's not supposed to happen. You do have padding, but that constant shaking of the brain and it can actually cause it to be displaced and even be knocked loose, and people have died from that. So, but usually in most cases, when you're constantly being punched in the head, it's just a temporary displacement. But if that's being constantly happening, it could be knocked loose, and people have been killed in boxing from that. So it definitely has its long-term effects. Again, the famous boxer Muhammad Ali, um, later years, definitely major physical decline. And basically what he was experiencing mirrored Parkinson's disease. He developed slurred speech, slow movement. His gait wasn't right. He was kind of shuffling. We actually call that dementia pugilistica. So or what you call punch drunk. It's a term they used to use. But it mirrors very much what someone has in Parkinson's disease. So that's why today the concussion protocols, there's a lot more stricter ways of handling those. And that has also been caused by another disease called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy encephalopathy. The movie Concussion, which we're going to watch that in class, starring Will Smith. He actually plays Dr. Bennett Amalu, and Dr. Bennett Amalu actually called out the NFL on this because there was a lot of players developing this who had massive amounts of concussions. Some of them were almost their brains had been so messed up at age 40, some of them, their brains had almost become like someone who had dementia as an 80 or 90-year-old because of the multiple concussions. And a lot of times they were having a bad concussion and then being sent out there to play again without proper time for that brain and its neuroplasticity to heal. And eventually these people were developing severe brain destruction or what we call CTE. So we'll be watching that film so you can see how Dr. Amalu bravely went up against the NFL, even went to the US Congress to help get concussion protocols changed. So, and it has gone all the way down into all levels of sports, now, from professional down to college, even to high school now. When you have a concussion, they will pull you out of the game and do certain things to kind of see how well you are if you need to even get it back out there. They may not even put you back out there immediately as well. So, all right. So that is neuroanatomy. So hopefully you enjoyed topic two, learned a little something. Again, we'll be doing a lot more with this in class, but hopefully that'll get you caught up on the main, terms and principles behind this. All right. So you have a blessed day. God, take care.